Okay, good morning, Lauren. Ani gela.
Morning.
Ta deoro wa dharamsala. Uh, Nyingu dele. Ta
Hi.
tanda di lawa samsra gela.
Huh?
New York Times nang lo la. Ta som chimbu shuji tönyo re nyeja.
Yeah.
Re nang lo la jana shungu tsuwe gi jadyo lopta digi korla. Pe masiwe gi som chimbu ji tönyo. Ta changme tonan chi gi nenga ji chade yore rwa gela.
Yeah.
Di intu zambala thangbo de la ta 단대기 뉴욕 타임스 낭로라 된베기 니주디타 nenga chelo ro chag yorwe di ke chelo khazus jirebe di rindang ro zo di khar chag yorwe wa in to say this in English, there has been a lot of conversation and talk about this huge New York Times article that just came out about the boarding schools in Tibet. And my question to you is, what is the significance of this in-depth New York Times piece on China's boarding schools in Tibet?
제 단도라 단디 다리 뉴욕 타임 단디 제키나 크랑초가 뉴욕 슈퍼랍 그래. 단디 제치 거니 지픽 차쇼 첨보시 그 첨보시 그래. 로지 예랑 저 제치기 나로나 시진 첨보요죠. 딘다시 거니 알론초가 Mr. Huirang 그 자도서부터 자나가 가서 그 사찬의 비시 머릅 살와디 자질교 요 디그 꼭지디 제치그디 당찬된다 토시 그 친구들다 그 동디 삼바 내가 저 원머리그 디그 답들한테 나 전에오나 그러나 안는 거 첨부 쳐도 점상 가려면 아주 원머리디 염총에 원머리그디 강했던 접수근 욕자데 시고야나 원머리 그 독시 랑라테니 시마토와 저장 제치그 접주토야데 머시크 첨부 쳐도 그래 된통 다리고 당찬 끝이 신드네 그거 다네 된다고 십측까지고 돈디 삼바 내가 쇼뇽 줘 내가 네 야시래세 이 되듯이 통고요
Los. For Lauren, for you, what is the significance of this article?
Yeah, I mean, on a couple of different levels, I think it's significant. I feel like first, it's hugely significant for Tibet and for the Tibet-China conflict overall. I think it's one of the most consequential articles, major media stories on Tibet in decades. Especially because China has so almost completely sealed off Tibet. No international journalists are allowed without their permission. Only a handful get to go there in a year or two these days. And then, so no international media presence is there. Tibetans really are not allowed out, but a handful of people, most Tibetans are just starting to be allowed from overseas exile community to go back. Most, only after a rigorous vetting process. So, it's really, it is difficult to tell the story of what's happening on the ground inside Tibet. And the New York Times, I feel like with the story, they went such a distance to tell the story. They really did in-depth research. They used, they went the extra mile that I feel like journalists and the media should for the least free place on earth, as ranked by Freedom House, 0 out of 100 in the score for civil and political liberties in Tibet. This is the kind of story and work we should see by journalists and by especially the major media organizations with the resources to work extra hard. And they did. I mean, the reporting, the article, the evidence that they had, the videos and the photos and all of what they used in this story, the reports, academic reports, Chinese academic reports. I mean, all of the sources, everything. It was just really an incredibly in-depth, well told. It was really a beautifully told story of a horrific tragedy, egregious injustice, major, serious crime against humanity that's taking place right now inside Tibet. So that was hugely significant. And then, of course, for the story, the issue itself, the colonial boarding schools in Tibet and China's all the lies China tries to uses to try to defend what they're doing on the ground, that the schooling is good for Tibetans and that parents want it, kids love it, and that it's all very Tibetan focused, but that it's sort of good education. I mean, I feel like they did the job of showing us that it's the education system itself is hugely flawed and that actually abusive, I think, towards the Tibetan children, and ultimately a threat to the survival of Tibetanness, Tibetan identity in our own country, on our own land, and that's the intention, likely.
Yeah, gela thanda ladung gi la chik di New York Times ki ta chidane zomda dumda de TV kap de la khandar pe masiwe ting sabu droe jorwa daringi jushi di kala ting sabu shu chindus like dwa ta di indu samba like gela gi New York Times nam nyam dola ta them mangbo chandi che yore ani konzo la chik chandi che du samba la New York Times di 내돈 찍어가는 게다 요다. 지단에 내돈 마부가는 게다 요다. 내돈 찍的가르스나 건조기 fact check 라이스도 fact check 라이드 미녀 주다 오늘 호라로 쇼지 띵 사부 루로다. 아니 고수 톡보 미카시 쇼지 순거로 부스도 차이로다. 이네 게라기 냠용근랑 로라. 때 게라기 대망보 잔디 제외기 유림랑 로라. 아니 뉴욕 타임스 냠돌라. 다 인터뷰 잔디 제도 게라기 초르와다 용소로 냠용저와 디 칸데다우지 총소에
당에 저 냠뇽다 마소나 데다시 송송 데 저점 차네 릴하우 말에 그런 저거디 냠십 지등데 그 네가 먹기 통조 냠스 용요죠 빵떡 콩대인죠 네라 십첩부거니 로고도와 공몽매죠 십천만이 저 뒤를 때려 코너고 꼬네 고급문도 내가 아주 지그려 말을 다 나랑 초이나 김치랑 보는 거 희용소소 네가 냠시지니 자지요자 소소가리 통요바 소소가리 뇽요바 소소가리 냠시지니 지금 레오가리 통요바 네 차선 그런 소지 정말 성신 거는 리시잡네 구투자이 데 코란초 지 다라 실로 지 착쇼디 도온디 삼바 띠온디 삼바 그래서 나는 소소는 니스 통요죠 뉴요 데이터 따라랑 디샤도 삼제 되고 초라 그쯤 보용도 내가 거네 제치가 니사지나 제치가 거네 고 로파부 몽보 차투시 거네 담블랑 로파부 정감 몽르치니 아니 코란초라 부 원는 그 강에디 더더 임바디 길라 이치 자치를 해야라 그쯤부터 온 것도 와 니건데 가 손지나다 다리 그 뉴욕 탐람들에 약그 코로나도 뉴욕 볼라고도 단 딜라 첫 투시 거네 최된 거네 아주 오는 그 머르 서와디 자둘 홉다디 락 춘찬라고 이제 비추다네 지금 리종 당 카트지 메와조 요디가 뻥땅나로 제치가 첫 투시 롱바보 롱큰 코로나도 내가 소 대자도 네 통송다
Los Gela. Yeah, I was asking Gela about how it was working with the New York Times in general through multiple interviews, and also working with their famous or infamous fact-checking protocol, the fact-checking methodology, and how detail oriented and how serious they are about the all the fact-checking they do on every little piece of information. So for Laden, you were also quoted in this story, and for you, what was your experience being interviewed by the New York Times for this story?
Yeah, right from the beginning, before we put that report out, we had that this was always our goal for the kind of media side, is if we could get a New York Times story, let alone if we could get a New York Times cover story, but a deep investigative one. Like, we provide our report and we say to them, if you tell the story and you check and investigate and do all the work that we can't do because we don't have the resources nor the experience in that way. And they really did it, and it took a long time, but we were able to provide our research and our analysis, and of course Genla able to provide on the ground eyewitness testimony and his observations. And really there's nothing quite like Genla's perspective, because he worked in Tibet for decades in the field of education and he saw this himself. But what I was actually, so all of that is there. And then when the story itself came out, I was just blown away by how much they found, because they really looked and they really tried. And I feel like that's the challenge to the other media organizations and to anyone doing work on Tibet. The information and the sources they had, went beyond what we were able to provide them with, well beyond. And I feel like that's the key here, is that it's such a strong, good story, and it's, the bar is set very high, in terms of they're really for us to have a cover for this issue for Tibet. I mean, for us, for Tibetans, to have this as a cover story, not just a major investigation, but a cover story of the New York Times, in the Sunday New York Times here, which is what you want your story to run in terms of print still, and the international edition, front cover, color pictures on the Monday, above the fold coverage is just astounding. And it's so important for Tibet and for Tibetans and for our truth to be told. That's the kind of story and that's the kind of space that we need. Sorry, I have a small human, of course, coming to talk to me now.
So there is no doubt that this is truly a momentous, media moment for Tibet. How has China responded to this story? Canada tandabato yalen chetan dawda chiyorwa the candidate which chungyona.
Canada yalen chetan ro ji academic na 연구도 지 산지 질럽 칸 연구도 섬니 그런 미 건설 게라 지 너보조야 그래까지 럼바 섬지 연구도 디리테 그런서 뎀바다가 내리 그런서 쇼나 매장 그런서 그 야는 지정대가 그런서 지 내란 로그만도 왔고 그런서 뎀바다가 내리 매장 내란 로그만도 차샤나 디 감니 그 길을 나가신도 디게 지 라베가 리 지정대오나 그 기온 흡수고 종lik 거니 자도 흡다가 닌카리 고 통통만도 대치제 디 드네 비칭게 코로 자는 그 탑식 직직하나 보바시가 잘로래 하신도 그거 가지고 대 오지시 니가 바로라 감치행도 와 가르치기도 되나 나는 저거 원 머신디 그 체크 요구 강에티 가와니 연구도들 자도 흡다가 다는 연구도들 같이 딜라온디 참바 그거 가지고 지신이 그 바로 감축 가르치 뱅도 나 그거 디직도 번나가 전에 다 전신을 주고 보빠치 하선 원는 거 보고 솔라 호수고 기운 호수 제고 매제 딜랍도 되네 디바로라 감치 행도 딜리카 지던데 연구도 아니 자도 흡다 라비아 디그 닌카당 리기종당 머릅사위 바로 그 딜름 죽고요 바당 디리티 디가 노파디 디가 인습을 하는데 통마토하지 그것들이 말아봤지 그런 게그 용화된 용서를 찍라니 로고였던 그런 거 야란티 네트워크 로고만도
Los Kela. Yeah, it's really interesting. I think the way China has responded, mostly they're not responding to the facts. They're not responding to the information. They're not denying any of this, right? All they're doing is they are demonizing the sources of the information. They're demonizing people like Genla, right? And they are trying to divide the Tibetan community. That's like really their strategy. So, Laren, in your case, from your observations, how do you think China has responded to this article so far?
Yeah, so we haven't seen the full breadth of their response. I think because this happened at the same time as the earthquake, the article came out shortly after, which was something, of course, that kind of, it sort of took us by surprise, and it felt like a lot. But it's just, I guess they made the decision, the editors, that Tibet is in the headlines, and that this, I would assume their decision is that Tibet is in the headlines, and that more context about what's happening in Tibet while you're watching an earthquake recovery and seeing the earthquake is important for the international community, the readers. There's an appetite for Tibet stories. So I think that has to be put out there. So China's, obviously, the Chinese authorities are distracted with the earthquake. The Chinese government is, and they're having to defend themselves there, because we're already seeing them try to block the relief efforts of Tibetans and use this as a propaganda tool, a disaster and the tragedy and the loss of lives, which, should never be used in this way. But I think what we have seen is that, of course, immediately the trolls, as they say, the Chinese backed sort of commenters. So the New York Times quickly shut down the comment section of this article, because we saw right away it was just all filled with clearly commenters that weren't real readers, and say, individuals that are just putting their opinions there. It was just like an attack on Tibetans and the article, the New York Times, and just saying, oh, you're against education, and all these really silly, shallow, transparent, sort of kind of pathetic lines of defense. And I think the thing we've always been very clear about, and China's done this in the whole campaign in its response. I mean, they've really prioritized, demonizing us, Genla, the exiles who don't want Tibetans inside to have education, and all of these things, which are, of course, not true. And we've always said very clearly that this is not about whether or not Tibetans have education. Of course, that's just silly. Or whether or not Tibetan children should learn Chinese or Mandarin, that's also obviously not the question or the issue. It's that Tibetans in Tibet and Tibetan children today have the right to live with their parents and not be sent to boarding school, especially very young children. And that nearly almost all of our entire next generation, like the overwhelming majority, are in boarding schools where they've been coerced to go. I mean, there aren't other alternatives. So that's key. They've shut down the local schools. They've shut down, everything, every other possibility. So Tibetans have no choice but to send their kids to these schools, which means to send them away. You can hear my 3 kids upstairs yelling in the background, like, every child has the right to live with their parents. Every parent has the right to live with their children. That's where they're safest and cared for best. So that's, obviously our first priority. But after that is that the Tibetans in Tibet have the right to learn not just one class of Tibetan language, which is what they're sort of teaching badly, not in even every spot. But Tibetans have the right to learn in Tibetan, their mother tongue, in Tibetan, on Tibetan land. Tibetans have the right to learn in Tibetan. Yes, they can learn Chinese. Of course they can. And that should be secondary to Tibetan. And they can learn it fluently later in life. They can learn it later in school. They don't need to be learning in Chinese medium in order for them to be fully functioning, well-educated humans. That is not, if you look at international standards of education, if you look at what's best for the child, the research shows mother tongue based education is best for the child. Tibetans have learned that in exile, and China is trying to forward arguments. They're not even trying to argue these arguments, because they can't, because international best practices in education and in child psychology and in everything say what they're doing is wrong. And so they only can argue on this superficial level, saying Tibetans in exile don't want Tibetans inside to have education. What a silly, ridiculous argument. But that's what this powerful, government does because they've got nothing else. And I think the article did a very good job of showing that they say one thing, but in practice, even according to Chinese academic researchers, the results, the impact is something else. And they know that. Chinese leaders know that Tibetan children are suffering in this Chinese state-run boarding school system. And because of this education that just forces them only to learn essentially in Chinese, then they're losing these kids are an entire generation of Tibetan children. And the impacts are going to be huge for us for generations to come, are losing the ability to communicate in their mother tongue. And right now that means with their parents and grandparents. And that is just a crime of massive proportions.
Awesome. Thank you. Anything to add, Gela?
다디 네 가는 데지 적고 삼송아 정도라.
Los.
점찬 가리드나 가서 다리 뉴욕 타임에 나래다 뉴욕 슈퍼람 나래 니그나 맞추고 좀 된다 십차 뻥떡 콩담바 내다시 돈이 제치가 거니 로파포 첫 투시 멍시 거니 멍시가 돈은 데라갔지 맞추고 우번나니 머르 멍부시 genre 머르 니 숨제 파체 젠디 자둘 흡다나지 자둘 흡다 레벤디 자nak 머리 ndalm mewa zoju gundi kuchi chimbu de jachi goni hu chimbu goni lopapu ndenda monshkina soushi tinduji tawade pe ka chimbu shire tongso.
Yeah, clearly a huge moment and huge accomplishment. The fact that a platform like the New York Times and also the degree to which this story has gone really in-depth, comprehensive investigation into such a difficult topic, it is sure to have an impact on the Chinese government and on policymakers around the world. In just a handful of years, this subject has become now an issue that cannot be ignored by policymakers everywhere. Right.
Yeah, and I think that's the thing I would add in closing is just the people who read the New York Times. It's the policymakers, it's people at the UN and in all the governments and academics and thinkers and people who are really engaged in foreign policy circles and engaged in all of the international issues, both policy making side as well as the advocacy side. And I think that for us is something to understand just from the Tibetan side, is why this is so important, because that is the world. We feel like this campaign is the issue is beginning to be understood. There's attention on it. There's been action, government action, really unprecedented in many ways, but we have so much further to go to bring about widespread awareness, because otherwise the information blackout and lockdown of Tibet and that sort of not hearing so much from on the ground, then people wrongly believe that maybe they have the impression out there, with all the competing news and all the issues of climate change and everything that's happening, people believe that maybe things there are okay. Therefore, maybe China's occupation of Tibet is okay and Tibetans are doing fine. And that is not the case. And in fact, our entire future is threatened. So something like this story is really important to help us make sure the world knows. And we need to keep Tibet in the headlines in this way, even though we can't get, real access to tell the story inside Tibet.
Well, thank you. Thanks to both of you for being part of this important story and taking part in this conversation. Gela tuchana da gela gi ngone de kali capture thariti nanglo la ngone gela gi samlo tang da nechu chepyo nanglo gi nyamyong ngone thane gi ta suso rangi mik thong we gi ger gi chor we gi nyamyong jorwa digi ani ngone thane tande gi tapsyo da pyo nanglo gi ne dun dige chasang ga la pe masiwe gi rindang chembo gi 뉴바지 퉁거 요래 삼기도 게라 어디 투체나 슈에
야야 디 단돌라 디나 지포 말해 나랑 저 레트로 차선 그 드몽 그 니와 냠뽕지네 후다바다 지주군 되어래 아주 냠 공부하는 모두 때 냠디 후다바다 지용쇼 되는 시죠
로스기라 오야 투체